Ever since the movie Saving Private Ryan came out, it seems like every single film that features some sort of an amphibious descent needs to have an opposed landing scene. Now, of course, the majority of landings through history were entirely unopposed for, well, a variety of reasons. That said, though, if there was to be an opposed landing in the 18th century, as, well, there are a few examples of that sort of thing happening, it isn't entirely unknown for the period, this scene is certainly not the way in which you'd want to carry one out. Now, this scene is from the television series Black Sails, which apparently has something to do with the Treasure Island book. At least it's vaguely based on that universe or some such. I'm not entirely sure. I've never actually seen the show, nor have I really even read the book. But based on this individual scene, it doesn't seem all that promising, and, despite Wikipedia's describing it as an historical adventure show, it doesn't seem like the sort of show that really pays all that much respect to the actual historic background which it's, well, based in. So our scene begins with a number of British ships, which you can just tell have 2 gun decks apiece when you see exactly where those explosions are coming from on their decks, bombarding a fortified position occupied by pirates. Now that each of these ships has 2 gun decks does tell us that they are certainly ships of the line, they are dedicated warships, and each one could well have anything from 20 to 70 plus guns. And by the looks of it, there are 3 of such vessels, with at least one smaller ship that may be a frigate or a sloop or anything like that, but just taking the 3 men of war, it means that there could possibly be anywhere from 60 to 210 guns total in that fleet, meaning that anywhere from 30 to 105 guns could well be turned against that beach, not counting, of course, that some of those guns would be chasers or any non-broadside firing pieces, but there are a great deal many guns which could be turned against those fortifications at any given time. There's a lot of firepower there. Surely, given how extremely open the pirate position is, despite their being slightly fortified with what appears to be nothing but driftwood, surely it would be more than sufficient to just completely, utterly eradicate the enemy by bombarding them from the ships. However, it seems as though only a few of these guns are actually being utilized for such a purpose, because we only see a few shots tried against the pirates, and to an absolutely pitiful effect. You see only a few of those rounds even hit their mark. And so, despite being very clearly within range to bombard the enemy from their ships without suffering any returning fire, the British decide to deploy their infantry with boats. Now, I'm going to have to assume that there's a much larger British fleet in this action that we're just not seeing in this particular scene for, whatever budgetary reasons there may be. Because only being able to count, those 3 men of war and then 1 smaller ships, we have, at least 24 is how many I can see in this shot here, at least 24 boats deploying men, with more coming in as some sort of a second wave out of camera shot. Now, this would mean that those 3 two-deckers and the other smaller ship would need to have a minimum of 5 boats apiece. And just to compare for you, HMS Victory, being a first-rate ship of the line, 3 gun decks and 100 guns on her, carried a total of 6 boats, and all of varying size. And so something tells me that a simple fleet of 3 or 4 vessels wouldn't have been able to convey this many men on this many boats, especially so very quickly as to get them all, ready in one single deployment. This sort of thing would imply that all of the ship's boats have been deployed, and so, if there's an officer who has to run over to give orders, something like that, or keep up communication, well, there's no hope of that, no hope of supplies reaching anyone, and of course, it would seem as though half the ship's crews are also dedicated to rowing these men onto shore, but, oh well, never mind, moving on. Immediately upon landing, the British are being fired upon by musketry and cannon shot. Rather than immediately pushing forward with bayonets and hangers to carry the day with zeal, however, we see the British opt to form a line to return fire, with muskets which don't seem to have actually been all that adversely affected by the spray of the ocean, especially considering there's nothing covering up and protecting those locks, at least not that we've been able to see. So they form front and fire a volley in extremely shoddy fashion. Almost everything in this scene here is wrong. We hear the command, 3 paces forward, shouted as if that means anything.
3 paces forward! Present!
Now, sure, you can order your men to advance 3 paces to the front, but as you can see here, the men were already advancing before the order was even given, and they were finishing the order when the man was finishing, well, issuing it. Not to mention, of course, there was no actual word of command on which the men were to commence this advance. Rather than just saying 3 paces forward, the command ought to have sounded something like 1st Brigade, or, whatever unit it is that's being commanded. Perhaps it's a particular regiment, perhaps it's a particular ship's crew, whatever, but 1st Brigade, 3 paces to the front, march! And on the word march, that is when the soldiers would actually commence or carry out the order that has been issued, not, while it's being said. Having by some miracle formed their front, the officer, who must have been, relatively new on the job, decides to skip entirely past the order of make ready and skip straight to the present from the shoulder. Naturally, the men were already coming to the present before the order was even being issued, and offer the pirates an absolutely awful volley for their troubles.
3 paces forward! Present!
And honestly, just look again at how terrible that volley is. It's almost as if they were firing by sections accidentally. So again, we have a seemingly useless shout to nobody in particular to form 2 ranks, even though, by the looks of it, the men were already in 2 ranks. And continued ineffectual musketry against the pirates' fortified position. Then the pirates do some piratey nonsense with a trap in the sand, which I don't even know really what purpose that serves other than to give the audience something to gawk at and think about, oh, how clever the pirates are from fighting behind a fixed position and not standing out in the open like those silly British are, and, using things like the environment around them to, to outsmart the enemy. Well, whatever nonsense it is. Now, you may have taken earlier notice in the scene that the British were trying to carry a few crates onto shore for, some ungodly reason, and many of them were being shot in the process, in fact, quite accurately so. Now, it would have been very stupid for them to be trying and bringing up things like spare ammunition or food supplies or anything like that when there's an assault being made, but thankfully they weren't doing anything as silly as that. No, in fact, they were setting up a mortar battery. Why they need to establish a mortar battery when they have 3 perfectly good ships of the line which had shown themselves to be well within firing range of this fortified position, I'm not entirely sure, but then I suppose it looks good for the cameras to have artillery or something? Why, we couldn't just have a scene of the men firing the guns on the ship? I don't know then, but oh well. Though there is one thing about the mortars which I like, which is that we do see them actually cutting the length of the fuses that they might detonate over the enemy in a proper location and cause more damage. Be more effective that way. And so that's quite nice. Except, of course, right, for the little fact that shrapnel rounds like this, like these ones being shown in the scene, were invented by Lieutenant Henry Shrapnel in 1784, well after this show's setting of 1715. Now, of course, it's true that basic concussive shells came to existence far earlier than this, but given the number of blasts in the sand that we see from these rounds as they explode above, it certainly seems as though these are meant to look like dedicated shrapnel rounds, which is to say that it is a bit of shot filled with both gunpowder and musket balls, rather than just relying on an exploding cannonball that was filled with powder to do the damage. I'd also like to point out how this man here seems absolutely terrified of his own mortar, which really reaffirms the massively unprofessional feeling that we're getting from this army. Oh, and smoke bombs like this wouldn't be coming around until well into the 19th century, by the way. Finally, as the British begin to actually advance along the beach, rather than just standing there and exchanging fire against an enemy within a well-fortified position, the pirates immediately begin to break and run away. And it's not really surprising. Look at how close the distances are when the British here first landed, and the numbers that the British have in relation to the pirates. Now, keep in mind that they aren't meant to be fighting an enemy army. They aren't fighting enemy regulars. These are meant to be pirates. There is no world in which the regulars couldn't have just fixed bayonets or drawn hangers and pressed into a melee. You need look no further than the American War of Independence for countless examples of this sort of thing, such as Bunker Hill, the Third Assault, or the Battle of Camden, to see where the pushing in with bayonets in the face of a vastly superior enemy, numerically and in terms of their positioning, carried the day on numerous accounts. One excellent example of a situation which is actually remarkably similar to what we're watching on the screen right now, at least in scenario or beginning conditions. Of course, it ends very, very differently. It's called the Kips Bay Affair, which was in September of 1776, so very early on in the war, which featured the British landing forces on an occupied beachhead by boat. Only, unlike in our little scene here, it was after a heavy ship-based bombardment and at the sign of advancing boats that the American militiamen who were occupying their breastworks immediately broke and ran. Now, if anyone would be interested in seeing a part 2 to this video, there certainly is a great deal more things that can be discussed when it comes to this scene, but for now, I think I've had enough complaining for the day. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.